I'm Connie Freightman, a project assistant here at the library, and I'm honored to introduce the moderator and panelists for this session. Leading today's discussion will be Dr. Crystal S. Anderson, a dynamic scholar working in the fields of transnational American studies, Black internationalism, and global Asias. An affiliate faculty member in African and African American Studies at George Mason University. She is also director of KPK, K-Pop Collective, the oldest and only Aka fan site for K-pop, and project manager for the Digital Humanities Project, K-Pop Culture. She is the author of 2 books, Beyond the Chinese Connection, Contemporary Afro-Asian Cultural Production, and Soul and Soul, African American Popular Culture and K-Pop. She will be in conversation with Dr. Zachary Price, an associate professor of drama at the University of California, Irvine, where he teaches critical studies as part of the undergraduate curriculum and the joint doctoral program with UC San Diego. His first monograph, Black Dragon, Afro-Asian Performance and the Martial Arts Imagination, is an interdisciplinary project that uses a performance studies lens to explore the ways that movement practices such as East Asian martial arts created moments of solidarity, rupture, borrowings, exchanges, and reinventions of selfhood, particularly among Black American and Asian American men beginning in the mid-20th century. Dr. Mark Villegas, is an associate professor in American Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. His book, Manifest Technique, Hip Hop, Empire, and Visionary Filipino American Culture, examines Filipino Americans' decades-long commitment to crafting, world-making, and collaborating in hip-hop culture. His new research interests focus on overlooked Black and Asian co-inspiration and collaborations in anime fandom, video games, and hip-hop. Finally, we have Tolden Troop Williams, an Atlanta-based artist, entrepreneur, and cultural innovator, best known as the founder of Trap Sushi, a global lifestyle brand and event series that blends anime, hip-hop, cosplay, gaming, and food. Trap Sushi has grown from 25 attendees in 2020 to thousands worldwide. He is also the creator of ATL Anime Fest, Atlanta's first full-scale anime music festival that debuted on October 18th, 2025 at Center Park Stadium. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Anderson. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much, Connie. I am super excited to have this conversation with 3 people who are very much involved in this intersection between Black American communities and Asian communities, and I hope that we can have a vibrant conversation. So to get us started, my first question has to do with what might be a surprising intersection between 2 groups of people. The idea of the intersection between Black American and Asian American communities often surprises people. And yet each one of you has examined or participated in these interactions in different ways. So to get us started, I'm going to pose the same question to each one of you, starting with Troop, because you are on my right on my screen. What is one moment in history or one piece of art or media that provides an interesting starting point for those who might be interested in the dynamic between the 2 communities, and what makes it significant?
Yeah, so for me, personally, when I was growing up, there was this program that started coming on Cartoon Network called Adult Swim, and one of the shows that they had on there was called Samurai Champloo. And Samurai Champloo was the first time I had ever seen, I'd already seen anime before because I'd seen like Naruto, I'd seen like One Piece, but that was the first time I heard like hip hop beats over like anime, and I was just like, bro, what is this? This is amazing. And it was so cool to me because one of the things they did, because they incorporated, it was like lo-fi beats, but it was also like scratching, like DJ scratching in the middle of the fight scenes. Like they'll be fighting, swinging swords, and then you'll hear like a and it would like reverse and then go back. I was like, bro, this is crazy. I love it so much. And I think that was the very first time I saw like the two worlds kind of collide. Um, and I don't know, it just stuck with me. It was really, I thought it was really really cool to see that blend together. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that was signifying how the animators over in I think it was animated in Japan, and the creators were partaking in hip hop culture. And they liked it enough that they wanted to blend the styles, which I just thought that was really really cool. And for me, that marked the start of seeing these two worlds collide.
So that's really interesting because for you, it was visuals and music that kind of came
Hmm.
together in that particular site. Um, Mark, what about you? What is one piece of art or a moment in history where a person could start if they were interested in this intersection, and what makes it significant?
I just want to echo Troop in saying that anime did bring these communities together and the interests of like the Black community with Asian American popular culture. Video games, I think even stemming back to like the 80s and 90s, we can see that type of interaction with Japanese media products. So I think like in some of the language around like BlurredCon, Black Nerd Convention, which is a convention in Washington, D.C., like this blurred identity, Black nerd identity, a lot of folks think this is a new thing, like Black folks as newly arrived to Asian popular media. And I know Professor Anderson knows this very well. It's not new. Like people have been, African Americans have been engaging with Asian popular media for a very long time. So the identity, the community of like Black nerds is probably new, like people coming together to gather. It's probably a pandemic thing, but that engagement with video games, with martial arts, as seen as like different or not really Black, that has been going on for a very, very long time. I would like to extend the idea of military bases as these connectors of Black folks with Asian popular media in Japan, in the Philippines, in Korea. So for me, it's like the real material migration of people and economies and ideas that brings about these fandoms that stems back 100 years, 120 years, that I'm interested in looking at how people arrive to these very real products, very real people arriving to these very real products. And one way of arrival is through the military bases with Black folks who have been living because of U.S. imperialism. So I like to like refocus some of the attention to the historical manifestations that allow for these fandoms to arrive. So that's kind of what I'm really obsessed with right now.
I have to say, like piggybacking off of that, one of my closest friends who actually works with me and helped me like with the start of the party was born in Japan because his parents were military, in the military. So he was born there and kind of like grew up experiencing, and then they moved back here to the States. Yeah.
Not a surprise at all.
So one of the things that I noticed in hearing both of you talk is a couple of things. One, the recurrence of anime as a kind of popular music, popular culture site, but also the significance of the actual historical context that brings actual people together, both inside and outside of the United States. And I'm going to turn it now to Zachary so that he can kind of join us in this conversation with the exact same question. Is there a moment in history or a piece of art or media that provides an interesting starting point for someone interested in the dynamic between these two communities, and what makes that significant?
Yeah, I think that both Troop and Mark have gestured towards a number of different kind of trajectories in which one can begin to explore the juncture and disjuncture between the African diaspora and the Asian diaspora, be that in the US or globally. For me, as someone who started getting involved in martial arts when I was a teenager, when I began working on my first research project as a graduate student. I was really curious about finding martial arts in theater. My pedigree is in theater and performance studies. And I came across some archival footage by a gentleman named Fred Ho, who had created an Afro-Asian music ensemble starting in the 80s and had been involved in a number of different political movements, including Iwar Chin, Marxist-Leninist Maoism, Asian American movement, had even joined the NOI at one point, Nation of Islam. And he also created these Afro-Asian martial arts, theater, musical fantasias. And they were in many ways a la jazz, blues, but also a gesture towards hip hop, kind of recyclings and borrowings of both the kind of jazz blues aesthetics that you might see in the 60s and 70s of filmography that was created in Japan or in China, but also the kind of interventions that the Black arts movement made during the 60s and 70s. One of his mentors was Archie Shepp, and one of his other mentors was Sonia Sanchez, as well as Mary Baraka, the late famous poet. And Fred Ho essentially took the aesthetics of the Black arts movement and fused it with Asian diasporic sounds, instruments, and musicality, as well as martial arts, to use and create a new kind of choreography, much in the same way that Black people borrowed from European instruments, the clarinet, the saxophone, et cetera, to create a new kind of aesthetic and also a new kind of epistemological framework for the Black American experience in the Western Hemisphere, right? And so in many ways, Ho's work really spoke to my own interest because, again, I was thinking about, okay, what is an example of a martial arts artistic sensibility that gets manifested and created within live theater? So I would say someone who's interested, looking at Fred Ho's archives, which continue to speak to people, and his filmography or his archives you can also find online, would be an excellent place to start.
It's so interesting that you bring up Fred Ho because it's a great juxtaposition or conversation between not only different genres of music, jazz versus hip hop, which was brought up with Samurai Champloo, but also time periods when you invoke the 1960s and 1970s and how those politics were really at the fore, which also links back to Mark and the kind of role that militarism might play in the intersection or the interaction between people in these two communities. And so that brings me to my next question, that these dynamics between Black American and Asian American communities don't really occur in a bubble. So what, if any, impact do you see from the United States, global media, or foreign governments on the interaction between these two communities? How does context impact how we view these dynamics? And Mark, I'm going to start with you if you have an answer to that question.
Yeah, so I'm gonna return back to the military. That's kind of what my first book on Filipino Americans was about. And so, sort of to break form with the conversation and talking about like East Asian popular media, I want to like go back in time even further to looking at how the presence of the U.S. in the Philippines, this is like 1898, 1899, to like around the 1910s. Black folks were in the Philippines because the U.S. colonized the Philippines. And so you have descendants of Black folks, U.S. Black soldiers called Buffalo Soldiers, living in the Philippines to this day because the U.S. was in the Philippines. And so I think my first book and my kind of origin story was looking at Filipino Americans and how they're so involved with hip hop culture, especially on the West Coast, not so much the East Coast, and on military bases. So anywhere you go that has a large Filipino population, Virginia Beach, Jacksonville, Florida, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco Bay Area, Hawaii, you have a lot of Filipinos and you'll have a lot of hip hop. So think about Pharrell, Chad Hugo, the Neptunes. Um, and so I think what I'm trying to do with my first book is to look at Black and Asian intimacies and interactions and co-inspirations that are not so stereotypical East Asian, which is what folks are fans of right now. What I'm trying to say in my first book, The Manifest Technique, is that Black and Asian interaction precedes the fandom of East Asian pop culture that we're all kind of in right now. There's always been, for a very long time, a Black and Filipino interaction, and that still lasts to this day with actual Black and Filipino people who are both Black and Filipino, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, with people like her, the artist, and Saweetie, and a bunch of folks who are both Black and Filipino and making big moves in hip hop. But that's preceding that is this interaction that's colonial. So, I think one thing to remember about the Black and Asian interaction is that's beyond just thinking about Japan and Korea. Like there's something deeper there. And that's what I'm trying to say, that's Filipino. And so you have this intermediary culture with the military bases. And I've heard stories like this of Black folks on military bases in the States or elsewhere, Japan, Korea, who have Filipino friends who introduce them to anime. So you have Filipinos as intermediaries to Asian pop culture, that Black folks learn from, Asian Americans, i.e. Filipinos. And this can also interact with hip hop as well, not just anime and video games and K-pop. So I just want to kind of throw that in there and look at the invisible Asian Americans, which are my folks. So that's all I got to say.
Thanks so much, Mark. I have a bit of a follow-up just for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with the history of the intervention of the United States in the Philippines. Could you kind of talk a little bit about what that colonization looked like?
Yeah, so the U.S. annexed the Philippines 1898 Treaty of Paris. I think it's $45 million. So Philippines was a colony of Spain for 300 years plus. And then the U.S. came in and said, we'll take that and bought the Philippines for whatever $1 million that I said. And the Philippines was then a colony of the United States, taught English, taught American popular culture, sports, all that. That's why basketball is huge in the Philippines. Like it's like, you have a trinity of Filipino popular culture or Filipino culture, which is God, family, and the NBA. That's like the trinity of Filipino culture in the Philippines. So you have those Filipinos migrating to the US beginning 1920s, also 1960s, big migration to the US. And that's what I'm a product of, and my family's a product of, is this militarization of the Philippines through the Navy, and then the subsequent migration of those folks to the US, and hence this birth of Filipino American culture, which I'm trying to say is very much integrated with hip hop culture. And we're not really talked about, right, in terms of like Asian American popular culture too often.
Thanks so much. And you bring up a really great point about how, even though we're talking about the dynamics between Black American and various Asian communities, there's always other factors at play. Zachary, I wonder if you could chime in here and kind of expand a little bit about those other factors that impact the way those two communities might engage with one another.
Sure. Well, I mean, as to echo what Mark was saying earlier, I mean, it's important to understand the way in which popular culture does not occur in a vacuum, and it has a long history, which is directly related to colonialism and U.S. imperialism, especially in the Asian Pacific Rim. And as Mark suggested, a lot of these interactions often comes through military bases, right? And that's true not only in the Philippines, but it was also true, of course, in Hawaii, which the U.S. ultimately annexed in the 1950s, but also when the U.S. occupied, and some could argue continue to occupy South Korea and Japan. Again, you can debate the contours about how you think about that in terms of kind of like the geopolitical positionings of it, but it's also important to remember that if we think about someone like Fred Ho, or other kind of political activists and figures. Yuri Kochiyama is another example of that, as well as Malcolm X, right, who had his own kind of understandings around Afro-Asia. And we can maybe talk about that, tease that out in a moment. That in 1955, there was an important conference that occurred in Indonesia, and it's popularly referred to as the Badong Conference. And this was a coalescing of formerly colonized territories throughout Asia and throughout Africa that came together to kind of sit down and think about how they could move forward during the Cold War, obviously, but also responding to the legacy of U.S. imperialism and European colonialism. So it is also important to think about where we are now relative to, again, what has also happened in the 19th, even in the 18th, but also in the beginnings and the middle of the 20th century, which very much inform the way in which people take up different cultural discourses. I think one of the things that if we were to think about the late 20th century, that oftentimes inform or become the default for how people think about interactions between Black Americans and Asian Americans or people in the Asian diaspora is, of course, the 1992 uprisings in Los Angeles, where we saw conflicts or certainly exchanges between the Korean American community or Korean community in Los Angeles and Black Americans, right? And there is a direct relationship between the Korean conflict of the 1950s and immigration and migration of Koreans, and then the kinds of stores and loans that they were able to open up in Black neighborhoods and the loans that they were given, right, to participate in the US economy, specifically in Black neighborhoods. And people oftentimes gesture towards the Rodney King as kind of being the quote unquote inciting incident, when in fact there were numerous issues, ruptures, disjunctures, so to speak, without pointing fingers one way or another, that were kind of the tinderbox for that explosion. And one in particular, and there's an excellent book about the young woman, Latasha Harlins. Am I saying her name correctly? Who was killed by a Korean shop owner, shot in the back because she thought that they hadn't exchanged. The shop owner thought that Harlins was stealing something she was not. And there was this conflict, and it echoed a number of different conflicts that scholars have actually chronicled. Brenda Stevens in her book, and also people like B.J. Prashad have also gestured towards in his book. Everybody was kung fu fighting, and kind of echoing this popular song. But in this case, in terms of like the theme of this panel, also, everybody was kung fu fighting is actually kind of a metaphor for the ways I think in which we jockey in position relative to the racial hierarchy of the US. And that cannot be disentangled from the legacy of colonialism and US imperialism that Mark was gesturing towards earlier. So all of this content and media that is being produced and consumed and produced and consumed and manufactured and reproduced and repurposed is fascinating on the one hand, but to your point, it's also important to think about the political framework and historical context in which these things occur and unfold.
Thank you so much. Troop, did you want to add anything to what's already been said? You're muted.
I do want to say I'm learning so much just from hearing you guys talk, and I'm really interested, Mark, in your research on what you're with hip hop and did you say Filipino, right? The culture and the intersections that I'm really interested to hear more on that. Personally, with our last trip to Tokyo, with us doing our party over there, when we did it for the first time, it was very interesting to see, how people were receptive to us. And I know when we first started this here in Atlanta, I was like, I want to bring these two cultures together because, I've been to a lot of anime conventions and, I see that there are a lot more people there, and I see there's a need for them to gather and engage outside of just that convention. And, we made our logo, and we called it Trap Sushi, and then we in our logo we had it written in Japanese as well. I never thought that when we got over to Japan that it was gonna resonate with people so much, and they were gonna be able to read it and be like, "Oh, Trap Sushi, what's that?" And just seeing how a lot of people, how hip hop had influenced a lot of people over there and the way they dress and the fashion as well was so cool to me. Like, we're out at a nightclub and all the youth over there is singing along to, like Playboy Cardi or, some of the rappers that, everybody's listening to here. And that was just so cool to me. And being able to meet, some of the rappers over there. There's a rapper, his name's Yuki Chiba, who just had a hit song with Meg Thee Stallion, and talking with him and hearing how he was grew up listening to like Gucci Mane and like Wu-Tang and Ice Cube and all of these people. I'm just like, man, that's what you grew up listening to. That's so crazy. Like I'm like, same, so it was just really cool. And thinking back to kind of like some of the first times that I saw kind of these, this influence was there's this guy, his name's Nigo. And Nigo was the creator of this fashion brand called Bape, called Bathing Ape. And I'll never forget seeing, seeing a lot of my favorite rappers wearing the clothing growing up. And one of the first people I saw kind of like really engaging overseas was Pharrell. And him and Nigo got together. And they have multiple clothing lines now, but seeing that interaction just kind of further like cemented, how these two cultures were cross-pollinating, with one another and creating something brand new and very entertaining. I just think it's really dope how it was, started. And even hearing you guys talk and learning about how there were so many other things going on outside of just what was seen in pop culture that kind of led to these defining moments. I just think that's really interesting.
Thank you so much. And so, since you veered us back to popular culture, I have another question that's popular culture centric, and I'm going to start with you. The idea that when you have a popular culture, you also have fandoms that emerge around it. And in general, fan cultures have their own dynamics, and sometimes they create a kind of insider outsider kind of dynamic. What can you say about your experience of fans of the media that involve Black and Asian communities or forms of media or art from one community that draws fans across a culture? What draws fans to cross cultures based on what you've seen, Troop?
I think it's that it's different but similar. It's like you're getting almost like a taste of what you love, but also being able to experience something new. And I think that's the beauty of it. I know in Tokyo, their anime is everywhere. You see it everywhere, and a lot of the fans that are our age were like very welcoming. There wasn't much gatekeeping, because it's in the day to day, and it's a very respect based society, so it's easier to kind of view their appreciation of Black culture is just that kind of like more of appreciation than appropriation, you know. And as far as like fandoms are concerned, I think there's more gatekeeping here in America in these spaces. Like there's sometimes there will be a little bit of racism in the fandom. If you see a African American person cosplaying a character that may be Asian or white, you will see some bad comments sometimes on their pages, you know. But I haven't really seen that much racism between, Asians and Blacks in this world. I haven't really seen that so to speak.
Okay. Mark, you were telling us about BlurCon, so I'm coming to you. What has been your experience in terms of the fandom?
I was just surprised. I'm still surprised how big this fandom is. There's a bigger convention called DreamCon in
Oh
Texas.
yeah.
That's way bigger. That's probably like maybe 2 times or 3 times bigger than BlurCon. So the last conference for DreamCon was in Houston, Texas, because it was just too big. Originally, I think it was in Austin, Texas. Um, so for me, it's just like the magnitude of the Black fandom for anime, especially, and also video game culture. Um, but I would like to sort of piggyback on what Troop was saying earlier about the Asian, whether or not there's like sort of anti-Black sentiment or what have you. I don't know if that's the terms you want to use there, against, anti-Black sentiment against Black people. So one of my projects that I'm doing is interviewing and interacting with Black folks living in Japan. Um, so, long term or short term. And so I spent a few weeks with some folks over there, and I still keep in contact. And if you live there, I think it's very different than for tourists who are sort of only in and out in Japan, or have never been to Japan but have a fandom for it. They have a very different story. Those who have much more everyday contact with Japanese people, and I think all of them would say that yes, there has been constant um, pushback or interactions that are negative against their bodies. One guy I'm interacting with, his name is Maurice Shelton. He's suing several Tokyo police departments for racial harassment for stopping him, because there's no laws in Japan for police to, I mean, how do I phrase this? There's nothing barring police from racial profiling. There's no laws that say you cannot racial profile, whatever. Um, so they're trying to sue them and say that otherwise, that there's ways that the Constitution does protect folks from racial harassment. So this is a very much an unprecedented lawsuit against the police in Japan. One of his co-plaintiffs, is that the term? It was stopped 200 times by the police. And he himself, Maurice himself, one of the leaders for the lawsuit, 18 times by the police in the past, let's say, I don't know, 10 years or something like that, less than that. So let's, sort of differentiate between tourists and Black folks who have lived there for a long time, or Japanese Black people who are Japanese but have African ancestry as well. They certainly have a different story to tell about like their interactions with everyday Japanese people.
So you both have put us in the current moment in terms of how audiences are interacting with the cultural production or the media of these two communities. But I want to bring it back to Zachary. We may not talk about fandom in the same way when we talk about audiences who receive that media or interact with those communities in the 1960s and 1970s. But could you also speak to how what the appeal is for people to cross cultural boundaries to consume the culture of others?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think these things cut both ways, right, in terms of fan cultures. And fan cultures can be, on the one hand, they can be unpredictable. I think that the proprietors that create a particular genre, say like K-pop or J-pop, um, or even something like Takarazuka, which is an all-female review troupe in Takarazuka in Hyogo-ken, and Hyogo Prefecture, has a long history. It appeals to masses amounts of fans, primarily women, but it also comes out of this whole experience when Japan was also trying to expand into China and set up its kind of new state system beginning in the 1930s, right? So fan culture is, in fact, a way of not only engineering and creating an architecture for a particular genre, right? For a particular kind of, cultural artifact, be that K-pop or Takarazuka review or J-pop or even hip hop in the US, right? There's a lot of resources that go into constructing those fan cultures. But fan cultures also, I think, can emerge in more subversive ways in which people latch on to certain ideas and then recreate their own kinds of fantasias around them. I think, Troop, that's one of the things that you're doing, which is really fascinating. But going back to, Black Dragon, Afro-Asian performance, the martial arts imaginations, for Black people, right? And this is one of the things that I argue in my book and demonstrate in the book. For Black people in the US, say, especially during the mid 20th century, who were trying to think of a new way of movement, a new way of being, a new way of seeing and doing and being in the world, um, martial arts, East Asian martial arts in particular, also endowed with a particular, maybe either kind of philosophy or political philosophy, open an opportunity, a window to rethink oneself, right? Either through like kind of sartorial presentation by taking on, new clothing and new kind of corporeal stylistics, new languages, right? When you enter into a martial arts space, you oftentimes are moving into that space, and by passing through a liminal threshold where you perform a set of rituals. Say in the Japanese context, it's also oftentimes rei, like you bow. You have a particular kind of hierarchy within that group, right? So you have a kohai, senpai being the more senior person, kohai being the lower person. And as you move through the ranking system, right, and become Udansha into the black belt system, your identity is really constructed in that community around your experience and the level of knowledge and ability that you have. And that's true in Japan, and that's going to be true in whatever dojo in which you enter into, no matter where you are in the world. So that's a way of taking on a new identity, right? It doesn't mean that once you step outside and off the mat that you're no longer a Black American or something like that. That's not what I'm suggesting. But the temporal moment, the lessons that you learn and the communities that you form internally, either in anime, right? Or say maybe in K-pop or hip hop or J-pop or in a martial arts studio, can be transformative, right? And oftentimes those kinds of transformative experiences is where those kind of revolutionary moments and sparks exist. And they can be contagious, as we can see, like, anime doesn't know borders, right? Martial arts doesn't know borders. The repertoire does not know borders. The repertoire will move across borders, right? And it will pass from one body to the next and one community to the next. So this becomes a way not only of developing oneself, but also developing communities, but also a way of constructing new ways of understanding and being in the world. At the same time, I'm just kind of wrapping up on this question. It's also important to be attentive to the ways in which this can also turn into a kind of fetishization, right? So we think about fan culture and we're talking about popular culture. Popular culture is not just K-pop, hip hop, etc., but we also can think of like popular culture in theater. One of the longest running operas, which continues to be performed, is the Madama Butterfly by Giacomo Puccini, right? Which is a complete farce based on this butterfly or chocho-like figure, which is about a fetishization of a highly feminized Japanese female figure, which never really existed, right? And Puccini had never been to Japan. And his ideas were based off of Luther Long, who had also never been to Japan, right? But yet every year, Madama Butterfly continues to be performed, often by people in yellowface, right? Which is akin and synonymous to blackface. Not the exact same thing, but again, it's about this kind of changing of the body, dawning of a kind of new sartorial presentation, and putting on prosthetics and putting on yellowface. So it's important to be attentive to the ways in which these fascinations with others can quickly become a kind of objectifying gaze, so to speak.
Mark, you looked like you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just real quick. I realized I didn't really answer the question about like where these crossovers happen and how they happen. And I think Zach brings up some really good questions, like what's the difference between putting on these prosthetics to look like a different race and cosplay, which is sort of like very mainstream nowadays. Like these are very good questions and interesting thoughts I'm still trying to wrestle with right now. But Zach also mentioned his book Black Dragon, and I think this crossover, like where people interact, how they happen, food culture, I think is something that we can think about as a space of folks coming together and experiencing the other in a very intimate way. And Black Dragon is an actual restaurant that I was able to go to in West Philly. Zach, do you know about this restaurant? Basically, it's African
Oh, I do
American.
not.
So I mean, I don't know if he knows about your book, but basically, Black Dragon is a restaurant in West Philly. African American dude who started the restaurant probably 2022, 2023, and according to the website, because a lot of Chinese American takeout restaurants were being shut down or they couldn't be in business anymore because their children of the owners don't want to take up that responsibility. So it's sort of like the owner, I wish I knew his name. He was nostalgic for Chinese takeout, which was basically nutrition for the hood, is kind of what he was saying. Like black folks love Chinese food. They grew up with it. I'm also obsessed with this rapper named Lou Sid. Three chicken wings and a fried rice, like this type of meme video that he does. So black folks eat Chinese takeout food. Black Dragon is taking up the mantle of trying to, nostalgize and bring to light to resurrect the Chinese takeout experience through black ownership and through like harkening back to the 1960s with the black and yellow power movement, which adorns the wall of the restaurant, and remixing the culture, the food culture, with like egg rolls with collard greens in it. So it's like he's bringing in black Southern soul food and Chinese takeout food, and all of this curation of like intermixing and also solidarity of black folks and Asian folks. I think that's so interesting to me because it's an actual interaction with Asian Americans and African Americans, not simply the fantasia of it through media production, but the actual intimacies within these urban environments.
Thanks for bringing food into the conversation. Now we're all hungry. Thanks, Mark. So at this point, we've had, I think, a really great conversation, and we have some questions that our audience have posed for you all. And so this is just going to be a free for all. I'm going to throw it out there, and whoever wants to answer it first can just go ahead and jump in. Our first question is, any art or books you recommend and how we can learn more and get involved?
So, I mean, there was a book, I think it came out maybe in 2007. I think it's called Afro-Asian Cultural Political Connections by Heike Raphael and Shannon Steen. I believe it's on NYU Press. Um, that's a good place to start. I think the introduction and the preface have some really salient observations about the history of the connections and also the disconnects. Again, the junctures and then also the tensions, right? Because those things are usually are hand in hand between Afro diasporic and Asian diasporic people. Thank you, Mark. Yeah. And I think this is also a good opportunity for Mark for you to plug your book.
Yes.
The Filipino one?
The first one.
Yeah, it's called Manifest Technique. Oh man, what's the name of it? I got a poster right here. Hip Hop, Empire, and Visionary Filipino American Culture. I don't have it in my hand right now, but so yeah, that book is not so much about like the contributions of Filipino Americans in hip hop culture, but rather what hip hop culture means to Filipino Americans and how they recreate themselves in their racial imaginary and racial memory through hip hop culture, which has been the biggest form, the most important form of popular culture amongst Filipino Americans since the 70s. I want to plug another book called Black Nerd Problems. This came out probably 4 years ago, and these guys, Omar and William, have been doing this blog since like the 2010s, and they did a book based on their blog postings. But they don't use the term blurred in here because that wasn't yet popular when this book came out, but that seems to be the mainstream term that people have agreed to. Um, but this is funny. It has a lot of like scenes of like how they interact with anime and video games and also like, Marvel and all that stuff. So I would say this is a very highly entertaining book that helps us think about what we're talking about right now.
It's crazy you say that because that and piggyback off something you said, Zachary, about transformative moments. That is literally why we started Trap Sushi. Like I went to my wife took me to my first anime convention and I saw how many Black people were there. And I was just like, I thought I was the only one. I didn't even know there were other people. Like for years, it was just me and my other two friends discussing anime. And, you know, I would think I was like 25 or 26. So for like 15 years almost, I thought it was just me and my two friends until I went there and saw these other people. So I'm definitely going to check out that Black Nerd Problems as well.
All righty, we have a couple more questions. Can you expand more on the similarities to both oppressed groups?
That's a tough question. I mean, I teach a class on this stuff, so we can go a whole semester talking about this, but I would say just this comes to mind, and I'll sort of stop talking because it might be too much. But I would say that what is interesting to me is that the fandom for the East Asian popular media is a fandom for global North Asian popular media. So those who have a little bit more global privilege, who are first world, not considered like the poor Asians. So Korea, Japan are usually the popular media that US people, which includes African American people, consume and have fandom for. So I think that's the difference in sort of the global context of oppressed groups. I mean, yes, Korean people in Korea, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, and Japanese people in Japan are not white. They have different ways of being alienated and othered and all that. And as well, there's global privilege because a lot of folks from the global South are moving there for their own social status. So you'll have Filipinos as a minority group within Korea or Japan, and they are oppressed there. You get what I'm saying? So it's sort of like, I think what we can do is shift our vantage when we think about like Asian and sort of look at the micro levels of different interactions and privileges and hierarchies within that, and how we consume and participate in those hierarchies. I think I'm very curious about how that occurs.
And I would just add, it's complicated. That's what I like to tell my students with answers to questions like that. It's complicated. And if you move that, like you mentioned, the kind of post 1965 immigration wave to the United States, when you bring these various Asian groups, because it's not just we already had, based on prior waves of immigration, Chinese and Japanese here, but with post 1965, you get a whole nother wave of different types of Asians, all in the United States with Black people in a post 1965 United States. So there's certain forces, I think, that a lot of those groups have to deal with at the same time. They have different experiences based on when they get here and what the perception is. Black Americans haven't been here and haven't had that long post-slavery, post-segregation history, but also newer Asian immigrants that have that, as you mentioned, that specter of global, what happened in their countries to make them have to migrate to the United States under various circumstances. Zachary, did you want to add anything, or Troop, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, Mark, Crystal, I mean, and Troop, I think we know we could spend days talking about this, and really, it's really at the forefront in terms of discussion around the ending of affirmative action at Harvard, right? In the Harvard case. I mean, the Harvard case is just like the manifestation that everybody sees, but in fact, Ed Blum, who was the primary plaintiff in that case, has been doing this and on this march for a long time to dismantle any kind of affirmative action programs. Putting affirmative action, if you don't like that word, fine, throw that out. Any kind of mobilization program or program that enables Black people to succeed within higher education. And that's just a fact. You can go back and you can look at all the complaints that he's filed both at the appellate and also the Supreme Court level. And so what's important to remember in all of this, right, is yes, we can talk about the historical oppression of these groups and a multiplicity of different groups. So one thing is constant is fundamentally Black Americans don't necessarily participate in the immigrant story, in the immigration story. That's just a fact. Yes, migrants, maybe. Forcibly brought here, yes. But indigenous and Black people are fundamentally different in this story. That's not to say, though, that Asians, Chinese Americans, Filipinos, Japanese Americans, especially during the 1940s for the Japanese Americans, right, have not also felt the violence and the ire of the state. Okay. Japanese Americans were forcibly removed. Japanese and Japanese Americans were forcibly removed, stripped of citizenship, and put in concentration camps. They were concentration camps because they were concentrated in places like Manzanar. Okay. A good this kind of critical performance of this experience and this juncture, and again, this juncture between Black migrants that left during the 1940s from places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, et cetera, the legacy of the South, came out to California for new opportunities, and then replace Japanese Americans who had been rounded up in spaces such as Little Tokyo and sent to Heart Mountain and to Arkansas, et cetera. Is a play called Bronzeville by Roby Theater Company in Los Angeles. And it is about a Black family coming from Mississippi that relocates to Los Angeles and occupies the home of the Tahars, which is a Japanese American family who have been forcibly removed. Not they didn't choose to relocate. They were forcibly removed at gunpoint under FDR's Order 8008, right? Because there was this fear that there was this insider that was going to take over during World War II, right? That was all propaganda. They'd already polled the majority of Japanese Americans, but for a number of different reasons, which we would have to tease out and parse out in a longer conversation, land acquisition, et cetera, just sheer political power, Japanese Americans were forcibly removed. Ironically, though, and this gets to, I think, the crux of it, when we talk about issues of redress, right? If the transgression is made against me either by an individual or by a group or a state, how do I get redress? That's oftentimes through our judicial system. And during the 1980s, President Reagan was able to offer Japanese Americans redress. He offered for each person who had been incarcerated during the 1940s in the concentration camps, I believe it was $20,000 or $22,000. Now that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but collectively, right, it's a lot of money. And when you have collective mobilization in terms of economic power, you can express that also as political power. There's never been any kind of redress for Black Americans, and that again, if we go back to 1992 and the Korean situation, and even today with the dismantling of affirmative action and the assault on DEI, that continues to be the tension, I think, because how do you access institutions of power to put yourself in a position so that you can do the things that you want to do?
Troop, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think they hit the nail right on the head with that one.
All righty. So our time is winding down. As you say, we could talk about this for a really, really long time. But I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to say a few last words as we let our audience go. Something that you would like them to take with them, any kind of shameless plug for any upcoming thing you're doing. I'm going to go ahead and start with Mark.
I don't have a shameless plug because I don't have any type of like book to advertise to you. But yeah, I mean, I think that these questions of like Black popular culture's interactions with Asian popular media and all that it's not new, but I think it's something that scholars are being more attentive to. And of course, Zachary's book on martial arts, Black Dragon, is gesturing towards this. But I think it's going to become more and more, in my prediction, something more and more mainstream. This questions of appropriation, this buzzword that I would like to pick apart. We can do a whole different like panel discussion on this term appropriation. I just mentioned earlier about like what's the difference between theater performance, yellowface, blackface, and cosplay. There's differences, but how do we tease that out and articulate that? I'm not too sure. But I'm just very excited to be in this space and to like interact with folks who are thinking about this in a very serious and dedicated way. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think there's one question here real quick about like K-pop and J-pop and how the influence of hip hop and R&B, and this is basically Professor Anderson is the expert in this, with how Black popular culture is just intertwined with what's coming out from, especially with K-pop and J-pop before that. One thing about the racial hierarchies, real quick, that we were speaking to last time of like how these different oppressed groups, what's the differences, what's the similarities. Here's one difference in similarity is that for globally, Black popular culture is usually suppressed, right? Black folks are usually invisible and seen as not the creators of something or not influencing something and taking on like a new identity. So I would sort of be cautious, and I know Professor Anderson is sort of has been thinking about this for a long time as well, is like how do we make sure that the popular media coming from Asia, from K-pop, doesn't veer into like the erasure of Black people and their influence? Because those same Black people from the 90s, Teddy Riley, they're making these comebacks in K-pop. They're the ones producing K-pop music, US, African, Black folks doing it. And let's not forget that. And let's not have Asian folks and white folks and Black folks erase Black influence within that. I think there's a difference when, Asian popular media comes out and it's, from Asia. People don't forget that. They know it's Japanese anime. Let's hopefully we know that and understand that with K-pop, that Black, African American soul within that and not erase that.
Thank you. Troop, any last words for our audience?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off that for a quick second. I actually used to be a songwriter for Atlantic Records, and I haven't been doing it for a while. But a lot of my friends that still are actually writing a lot of those songs and sending reference tracks overseas. And yeah, so a lot of it is a lot of our people. And even there's this guy, his name's Toa Dunn. So he's the global head of music for Riot Games, and he's like the brainchild behind this K-pop group called KDA. It's like they're animated. It's an animated K-pop group, and he's the brainchild behind that. It's a Black guy that's in music, and so a lot of people don't know. Like you said, a lot of us are behind the scenes, writing and sending tracks and things like that. But yeah, so that was. I'm glad you said that. I guess for me, a lot of people that if you're interested in this stuff, I would like to invite people to come out to Trap Sushi, which is the party that me and my wife throw, and to come out to next year's Atlanta May Fest. We'll be back in Atlanta at Center Park Stadium. So yeah.
All righty. Thank you so much. Zachary, you get the last word.
Oh, uh, uh, well, just quickly, I think Troop, in terms of the cultural production you're doing, I really encourage you to keep it up. I think so much of what we've been talking about is also regional. I've lived in all three, four major cities, both in the South, Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago. And I think these interactions are impacted by the regions that you're in. I'm currently a resident of Orange County, and there is a much smaller Black community relative to the Asian diaspora community writ large, and that includes Filipinos, Vietnamese, Koreans, Chinese, Taiwanese, etc. It would be interesting to see the kind of response that your work would have, the kind of reception Troop that your work would have in a place like Los Angeles and in SoCal. Because I think again, popular culture doesn't know borders, right? It'll cross borders no matter how hard you try to restrict those borders, because people are always moving, people are always on the go, right? And so that kind of transness is really important in terms of how we think about moving forward into the 21st century.
Zachary, Troop, and Mark, thank you so much. I think this has been a really great conversation. I hope that our audience got a lot out of it. Thank you so much, Connie and her staff at Auburn Avenue. And we hope that you have a really great rest of the day and as you move into your weekend. Thank you so much.